Welcome to Midweek Liberty. I'm J. Dylan Proctor. This is a program designed to intrigue you, to stir your nerves, and to offer your mind critical thinking and adventure.
And I'm Anthony Allegria.
Today, we're going to be discussing Anselm, and that's a saint from church history. We'll be doing that. That'll be fun here in a moment. Then we're going to talk a bit more about nominalism. Now, nominalism is what we talked about in episode 29 of Tools for Liberty. We're going to go back to that and how our culture is really being ripped apart by people misusing names and thinking that if you can just call something a certain name, it will change the reality. It'll change the narrative. And this is especially a concerning deal in terms of things like the topic of firearms. This is a real big problem, nominalism is. So we'll talk about that in our B segment. And then in our C segment, we will come back to talk about the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. Last week, we did a little bit of an introduction to the book of Haggai by looking at King Nebuchadnezzar all the way down to Cyrus the Great. We're going to follow up on that by talking about the siege of Jerusalem. Now, let's go ahead and jump straight into our conversation about Anselm. So often people try to suggest that the church and reason are opposed to one another. You really can only make that case that the church having faith and being a person of irrationality are antithetical to one another if you're, to put it nicely, if you're completely unfamiliar with church history. If anyone is familiar with the last 100 years, or last 1,000 years of the church, you will know that there is a long-standing tradition of not only rationality, but particularly the movement of scholasticism and how that's affected the world. So we're going to get into all of that in a bit, but let's just go ahead and get right into Anselm, because he's somebody who's attributed as being one of the early people in scholasticism, but he's a very important character. So let's get right into it. Anselm was an 11th century bishop. Specifically, he was the Bishop of Canterbury. And this is a big deal. He lived from 1033 to 1109. It really is worth pointing out how significant it is that he is the Bishop of Canterbury, because that has so much influence with that particular post. And Anselm is known for being not just a theologian, but he's also known as a religious philosopher. Specifically, he made an argument for the existence of God. One of the things that Anselm is very much known for is his ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, the word ontological, I realize that's a big word, and that one can be a bit of a distraction, but it basically just means what is the nature of God's being. He makes an argument, he makes a claim about the nature of God's being, he presents it for people to consider. Anselm's argument for the existence of God is both very simple and very complicated. And a lot of times people, when sharing Anselm's argument, they spend a lot of time building up to it, but I'm just going to go straight into it and let you decide for yourself. So Anselm's argument is this: God exists because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And just to reiterate that, God exists because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Now, I realize that's something which is a bit much to take in, and you may not be convinced, you may be a little bit hesitant to embrace that, but oftentimes one of the reasons that we're so hesitant to embrace this argument has to do with the lenses which we view the world with. It should be worth pointing out that Anselm doesn't start with the mentality of trying to convert people out of atheism. He's taking the stance of saying, how can somebody not be a fool in life? Actually, he bases his whole pursuit of the argument for the existence of God out of Psalm 52, where there's the statement that the fool is the one who doesn't believe. And he says, well, I don't want to be a fool, so I'm going to dedicate my life to not being a fool. And his approach is very different than what we expect a lot of times. So many times people listen to this argument and they really take the lenses of 2018 looking into this. And they also take the lenses of how atheists, who Anthony, I think, better describes as people who are not just atheists, but they're anti-theist, how they attack the church and how they want to only concede anything that's an empirical argument. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but let's just talk about Anselm for a little bit. One of the starting points that Anselm comes from is, again, not from the conversion of people that are atheist, but instead he's coming from the position of faith and of the position of deepening one's faith. He does not create a clever rhetorical device for converting atheists or agnostics, which is what we really would expect. Instead, he begins from actually something from Greek philosophy. He goes back to Plato's Forms. He goes back all the way to the Greek philosopher Plato. And he talks quite a bit about the Platonic forms, because this is so important to really understanding Anselm, is understanding the notion of Platonic forms. Instead of making really complicated long-term arguments, he simply says we need to look at the Platonic forms. And if you're not familiar with that, it basically boils down to this. Platonic forms are this idea that You can look at multiple objects and tell that they're the same object, not because of the similarities between them, but because they both match an idea. Take, for instance, an ink pen. If I were to say, imagine an ink pen, something would come to your mind. It may be a red ink pen. It may be one of those with a clicky thing on the end, and it may be an ink pen that you pull the cap off of. You may even imagine something like a calligraphy pen, or you may imagine something even older, that's something very simple, such as, say, a quill. But the idea of a pen, something which uses ink to write, is sort of this transcendent idea. There's not really one pen in the world which is more pen than any of the others, but at the same time, there's a transcendent idea of that. We do not have to come out and prove that there is a connection between a red ink pen and take, for instance, something like a green highlighter anytime we want to use one of the two. We can just naturally understand both of these are writing instruments which use a form of ink. And while there are wide varieties in different objects in the world, there's a great similarity between them. Take, for instance, a car, an automobile. You can take something like a Jeep, and then you can compare it to something like a Corvette. And while those things are very different, at the same time, you can look at both of them and recognize both of these are means of transportation. They're relatively similar. They both have four wheels. The wheels are made up of tires on rims. There's a light in each corner of the vehicle, essentially. There's a very similar design to both of them, even though they're radically different, a Corvette and a Jeep. But the basic idea is that there's a platonic form of the automobile out there, and while there may not be one car that is the true car, there are some great similarities between them. Well, Anselm comes to the idea of God saying basically this: God is, speaking in platonic forms, God is the thing which nothing greater can be thought. In other words, he is the platonic form that no other platonic form can be greater than. And he's basically saying that if you are to reject the idea of God, then you are to reject the idea of platonic forms. Now, this can be a really confusing thing at first, and we're not going to go too deep into it. We're going to come back to Anselm's argument for the existence of God in some future episodes. But we do want to talk a bit more about it. There's a monk that was a contemporary of Anselm who really came back to debate with Anselm. He didn't accept this. He didn't like it. His name was Guanilo. Guanilo really had three terms that he rejected this on that we're going to discuss today. One of them was that the fool mentioned in Psalm 52 may have had unreliable information. He may have been listening to gossip. He may not know what's going on. And his second point is you can't just define things into existence. And his third point was something about, well, if you say that God is that which there can be nothing greater than, what if I imagine something that is greater? What if I imagine a perfect utopian item? Well, we're going to talk about that here in a second, but for now, let's actually go and see what Anselm himself has to say about this. So, Anthony, if you would go ahead and cut us over to Anselm.
I am Anselm. I am the Bishop of Canterbury. My argument for the existence of God is this: God is that than which no greater thing can be thought. Now, I understand you may have some hesitation in embracing that. That's all right. We must start with an understanding that there are transcendent things in reality. Reality is not just about a narrative, a paradigm, or a story, but reality is greater than narratives, paradigms, or stories. There are things in reality which can transcend time, space, culture, languages. If we understand that if we can look at one thing and that we can understand there is a form or shadow of it out there, we can understand that there are things which don't just exist within our own mind. God is that than which no greater thing can be thought. It does not originate from within our own minds or from our own perception or worldview. It exists across time, across people, and it is that which no greater thing can be thought. Now, who are you?
I'm Guanilo, and I'm your worst nightmare, Anselm. How do you know? How do you know that the fool, if you're going to be all up referencing Psalm 52, how do you know that the fool hadn't just been listening to gossip? Somebody's sassy lies that they're telling.
Well, thank you. That is a good point to bring up. The question of whether or not the fool may have good information or may be listening to the wrong sources. But the point is this: reality is more important and more powerful than narratives are. It does not affect the transcendent form if the fool has bad information. Just because the fool may not be aware of things doesn't mean that it's not out there in reality.
I see where we're going, Anselm. Everything can just be defined into reality, can't it? Everything's just a social construct. Well, I like that. We can just turn everything into whatever narrative we want it to be.
You're correct. We cannot define things into existence. But that is not what we are doing. We are discussing things which already exist. We're existing the transcendent reality of God.
Okay, Ansel. What if we create a utopia, a paradise, a perfect island where everybody can bring their narrative and they will live in harmony with one another because they will each embrace their own narrative and therefore there will be no differences. We will call it Guantanamo Bay.
Ah, yes. The question of the Paradise Island and your perfect social utopia. Well, to your earlier point, we cannot define things into existence. Reality is more important than narratives. Reality is more transcendent than narratives. And to your point, we are not defining an island into existence. There are already Platonic forms which exist against that notion. Now, I should also point out that you're an arrogant piece of...
Alright, so do forgive the audio quality on things, especially at the end. Things got a little crazy. Anselm really didn't take too nicely to Guanilo. Though, I will say this. We are improving the audio, and also, we don't really want to give that bad of a rap to Guanilo. Actually, he brings up some really good points. Historically, I think he really has a valid argument, and again, our representation of Guanilo is purely for fun purposes. But all the same, seriously, as we come to this, a lot of times we are hesitant to embrace Anselm's argument that basically God is the greatest thing we can imagine, and that it's much more than just a figment of our imagination. It doesn't originate from inside us. That's what is so significant about bringing up the conversation of Platonic forms. They are greater than any one of us. They transcend any particular person. They're constants across time, space, cultures, languages. There's something which is universal about this. If we go back to even ancient Greece, we see that the Greeks understood there's some connection between the transcendent good and beauty, and there's a whole another conversation to be had about that, but we're not going to go there for now. We just wanted to present for you today this idea of Anselm's argument for the existence of God. It basically is this. If you believe in Platonic forms, if you trust Platonic forms to be real, if you trust the fact that you can look at a bean bag and then you can look at a winged back chair and say both of these are sitting things, they're both a chair, then you believe in Platonic forms. That's part of reality, and to remove Platonic forms from reality basically disables our ability to think. But the whole point on this is, if you can believe in Platonic forms, then God is the greatest Platonic form. And it's not just a form, it's not just an abstract thing, but it is the greatest thing in which we can really conceptualize, and not just conceptualize, but it's the greatest thing in existence. So don't get too carried away about this. I just want you to chew on it and think about it. You can send me your thoughts on Anselm's argument for the existence of God. One of the things that really throws us off is so often we want empirical evidence. For some reason, we've got this dichotomy set up in our world that if you can't provide empirical evidence for the existence of God, then you have failed. This is not the angle that Anselm comes from, and it's really foolish of us to think that we actually live in a world where we want empirical evidence for everything. We trust so many things that we do not have empirical evidence for. We don't have empirical evidence for all of the workings of consciousness, yet we still are perfectly content thinking. This idea that if we don't have empirical evidence of every single moment in reality that they don't exist is foolish. You can't even do an experiment unless you are going to accept the fact that there are certain terms that the experiment is taking place on. It would be an increasingly movement towards infinity in terms of experiments, just trying to get to do a conclusive thing on anything, because we take for granted that certain things are given, certain things are reliable. Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, to add to that point, the only thing really that is reliably empirical, the only thing that you can ever truly prove is that you are.
Yeah.
You can't even really prove much about concerning what you're thinking or experiencing. I mean, this is obviously shown in the case of the delusional. Yeah. People who are obviously delusional are making observations, and they're as empirical as they could possibly be to them. But it is not a true observation.
Yeah, that's something which is really interesting, but we're going to leave this conversation for now. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about nominalism in our culture and how it's being ripped apart from just this idea of some of the things that we poked fun at Guanilo for, and we'll be back with that in a minute. But for now, just enjoy this nice little commercial.
Today, we make our pilgrimage, not to a place of sophistry or fake news, but to a place where the divine gift of critical thinking is embraced.
Alright, well, it is the season of Lent. Pilgrimages are an important thing, and we'll be discussing about that Friday, the role of pilgrimages, and even Anthony of Egypt's great pilgrimage here during the season of Lent. He's actually training for his pilgrimage. He's not done it yet, but we're getting there. Alright, so let's talk more about nominalism. We brought this up in Tools for Liberty 29 last week, and basically nominalism boils down to this, and it's a weird word spelled Nominalism. Nominalism. Nominalism is a big word that's basically a simple concept. It basically boils down to if we name something a certain name, then it becomes that thing. If I name a dog a cat, well, then it's a cat. The reason why people are able to pull this off is because they argue that there is no transcendent reality. There are no Platonic forms. There's no abstract reality of a dog. There's no Canis lupus specification except the fact that we've called it Canis lupus and therefore it is. There's no reality that is beyond one object to another. There's no connection between objects. If you have a set of chairs that are all identical, they're not actually identical to one another. We just call them that they are and therefore they are. From the philosophical standpoint, a lot of people have had different takes on nominalism across the years, but for now we're just going to boil it down to the simple fact that if you name something a certain name, then it becomes that thing. This is really a big problem, especially with where our culture is at right now and how we deal with the nature of humanity. Are people naturally evil? Are people naturally good? You see a lot of things happening in our culture. A while back we talked a bit about the terpenes. What was amazing is something which was so obviously evil, you had a lot of people who were trying to not say that they're evil, but they say it was a result of homeschooling. It was a result of other things going on in the world. They were moving away from the behavior of the people to the medium that their behavior manifested upon. And here recently we've also had going on in the U.S., there was another shooting that happened in a school down in Florida. And a lot of times people, they don't talk a lot about the motives of the shooter. They always want to move the conversation to the medium by which the violence takes place. They want to talk about firearms. And really one of the problems that happens with the firearm conversation, if you could even call it that in the West, is that it really, and I hate that it boils down to this. And I don't mean to put people off when I say this, but a lot of times it does boil down to there are two groups. There are people who actually understand firearms and are familiar with how they work, and they're familiar with accurate statistics and the reality of how guns involve themselves with crime and how guns are used as self-defense and preventing crime. And then you have, on the other side, people who look at firearms as something that's like a transform. It just will magically turn into evil at any given moment, and they really don't know much about them at all. They basically just have an emotional argument. And I really hate that it fragments down to that. But it basically does. Basically, people who are actually aware of legitimate statistics and whatnot and how violence and things work out, they usually fall onto the side of people need to be able to defend themselves. And again, it's a medium for use of power, but it's not actually use of power. It's not actually evil itself. It's not actually good or protection itself. It's just a medium and a tool to be used, whether it be used for good or evil. Well, nominalism is a big issue with this. And Anthony, I know you had some thoughts on even just on nominalism in this topic.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I was thinking about just now whenever you were talking about the gun thing, to those who are on the other side who don't know as much about the statistics behind it, I really think it's not necessarily the transformer argument, but it's definitely a basis in, they're scared of the possibility of evil assuming that power, and guns are a powerful medium. But I mean, even whenever you reflect on the statistics of crime and how crimes really are stopped, guns are a much more powerful medium for good than they are for evil in all reality. But I think that's what they're scared of. They're scared of the opportunity for evil to take power.
Well, which also makes you wonder the question, are they scared of the evil within themselves, even though they're a lot of times scared to say that people have evil in their humanity? Again, I'm not going to attribute motive to people without due course of investigation, but it's one of these things where it really does boil down to a lot of people wanting to make an emotional argument. But my thing is this: we have to not argue this on the terms of we have to remove emotional and take this to a logical place. And again, firearms are a medium for things to take place. But again, nominalism comes into this very deeply because again, you get things like the AR-15 or you compare it to like the Kalashnikov design, people will say, oh, it's an assault rifle. And using the word assault to qualify its existence as a rifle, again, it's a nominalistic thing where it makes you perceive that it's more powerful or different or more deadly. Again, the arguments around this are generally incoherent, whereas it's different than any other rifle because you put the word assault in front of it, which anybody that's actually involved with firearms knows that the term assault rifle is actually quite loose. It's not actually a real thing in and of itself. It's basically just a name that's attributed to certain things and fairly inconsistently attributed to certain things. A lot of times you can have a more powerful cartridge on a rifle that's not one that uses a magazine or anything like that. And even when you debate how powerful is a cartridge, a lot of times people, and even in recent weeks, they've been making the argument that handguns generally shoot a slower round that's a lower velocity round as opposed to that faster, higher velocity round in a rifle. But at the same time, when it's being shot, if something pierces through you, your likelihood of surviving is a lot greater than something that's slower that's going to knock you down and do a lot more internal damage. The ballistics of things gets hairy really quickly. But again, a lot of the people making these arguments have no information that's reliable to them based on ballistics, or they have not consumed and processed any information reliable based on ballistics or anything like that. So nominalism is a big problem, and if we're going to eradicate evil in our society, and we actually want to make society a better place, we can't get hung up on nominalism and confusing mediums with actual sources of things. The primary expression, I know it's been a while since we've talked about that, but if you're going to be blurring the lines between primary expressions and mediums, we're never going to get there. However, there's a great example of this. We have a clip from YouTube, and this is a reporter who's, well, we'll just let you see it, and you will be able to tell the issue quite quickly. Yeah, totally. Straight up not knowing what one is talking about. That's absolutely a pump shotgun if there ever were such a thing to exist. However, the issue with this isn't just that they miscalculate what the weapon is, but also if you actually shoot something like a watermelon with an AR, it basically pokes a little hole through it. I mean, it pierces through it. It doesn't blow it up like a shotgun will. Obviously, shotguns make a lot larger cavity in something. But this is the thing, is it's, our culture is being ripped apart, and people won't even come to terms to debate with one another on rationality. We have this interesting thing where there are a lot of people who claim to be on the side of reason, science, and rationality, but they're actually not. Last segment, we talked a bit about St. Anselm and his ontological argument for the existence of God, and he was somebody who's associated with reason in the church, though he's not the same as Thomas Aquinas or some other people who get more developed and differently developed things down the road. He is someone who basically says, from the standpoint of faith, this is where we're at. We're not going to be arguing against atheists, not just because of the prevalence of such at the time, but what we now have in our modern world isn't so much that we have a lot of people who are atheist and agnostic, but Anthony, you actually brought up something really great, that these are really more people who are anti-theist.
Yeah, obviously, the implication of atheist is just that they don't believe. Yep. But there's a huge difference between people who don't believe and then people who are actively pursuing to convince others that God isn't real. It's one thing to suggest that, I don't believe in God. It may be the case. There's a lot of things that I don't necessarily believe in, but I respect the possibility of it, in the real world. But in regards to, how most people, the attitude that most people hold, it's not really an atheistic view. It's much more closely related to an anti-theist.
And of course, anti being against, meaning they're actively hostile and actively resistant towards something. It's not just that they're open to it and say, well, it could be one thing, it could be another, I don't know. But they're basically people who say, we're really hostile to this and we're going to do everything we can to eradicate it.
Yeah, and that's actually who would have the loudest voice, honestly, as well.
Yeah.
It's not the atheists who are saying, most of the time it's not the atheists who are coming out and even talking about it. Most of the time they can have some reasonable conversations. But, the anti-theist is the one that it is getting,
that really has
it's noticeable quick.
Yeah, for sure. But nominalism is a big issue with this, especially in our culture. We have a lot of things, and again, we don't really want to get too political in our show. I mean, we are a Christian podcast. We adhere to the standards of the kingdom of God first and foremost. But there are some things in our culture that we've really got to call out. And a lot of times people use nominalism to justify some really corrupt things, which, again, taken to their pathological conclusion, they're quite destructive. A lot of times people take not something that is not pure justice, they take the Platonic form of justice and they qualify it with the word social. And, you can ask 10 people what that means, and it means a lot of different things. But the roots of this movement and what is called social justice is actually, it can be quite corrupt. It's something which really basically wants to use devices of social manipulation to divide people. Even though they claim that they're doing it under the name of justice, it's much more established as something dividing people than it is bringing people together. And we really have to push back on this stuff. We have to be people of critical thinking. And just because someone names something doesn't mean that it's that thing. You can name stuff anything you basically want to, but if it doesn't bear out in reality, it doesn't hold water, then it's just a mess. We need to always be comparing things to reality. There's this crazy notion in it. It almost cracks me up. Anthony is so sick of hearing the word narrative. I myself am sick of hearing the word narrative, especially when I was an undergraduate. It just makes you want to split oneself in half. But the idea of narrative being more important than reality, this is just, it's really absurd. This is one of the things that Anselm, even if you go back to the scholastic movement, the question of do we just concede to whatever authority is of the day? What is the role of how we understand the world and then the world itself? How do you compare narrative to reality? And we're going to wrap this segment up on the fact that the kingdom of God is not a narrative, it is in fact a reality. Realities are more potent and more relevant than our narratives. Each and every one of our narratives may be corrupted, there could be something wrong with it, but reality is what really matters. And we'll be back here in a moment. Alright, so let's talk a bit about the Babylonian exile. In our culture today, there's a big question on how people can advance in life. There's the argument of, is everything determined by past circumstances? How much of a role does free will play? Why are some people doing better than other people? How much of a role is played by circumstances in determining the outcome of people's lives? How much of a role does success play in terms of our motivation? Or maybe I should say, how much of a role does motivation play in our success? We're studying the book of Haggai, which is a very short book tucked away towards the end of the Old Testament. And it's a minor prophet book about a prophet named Haggai. And it takes place when the people are being called to rebuild the temple. They had recently been released from captivity by Cyrus the Great. We talked a bit last week of Nebuchadnezzar up to Cyrus the Great. We did a little bit of a history in our last midweek Liberty episode. And if you would like to know more about that, please go back and check out our last episode. But today we're going to talk about the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, which took place in the 580s BC, because it's a really important thing in history, and it's also important to understanding how in the world do we deal with circumstances in our life, and how much do negative things in our past affect who we are in the future. Because all across time we find evidence of people being wrecked by things in the past, and then people who overcome it. And from the standpoint of Scripture and understanding who we are as the people of God, understanding the book of Haggai and the history behind it is really fascinating. It's really fun. So today we're going to learn more about the book of Haggai going back to the siege of Babylon. So let's begin. And we have some pictures that we can share with you as well. Those of you listening to the podcast in audio only format, it'll be okay even if you miss out on the pictures, but there's some wonderful artwork out there which conveys a lot of this tragedy and the sorrow therein. So let's get right into it. Nebuchadnezzar comes into power in Babylon in about 605-ish BC, and BC being before Christ, and numbers go in the opposite order when you get before Christ. So the Jews at this point in time, they were actually a vassal nation under Egypt. In other words, they were subordinate to Egypt. But after Nebuchadnezzar came into power in 605, he starts wanting to expand his kingdom, and they set their eyes on Judah. And of course, Judah is where the people of God are. And Judah went from being a vassal state of Egypt to one of Babylon, and very quickly we see Nebuchadnezzar coming over to conquer Babylon. Now the king in charge refused to pay tribute to Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar had him disposed. This was Jehoiakim. And of course there's some little bit of hairy details of exchange of power, but essentially Nebuchadnezzar comes along and sets up a new king, Zedekiah. And this happens in the area 597 BC. And of course this only happens after a siege is being made against Babylon. And Zedekiah, he reigns for about 10 years. And about a decade into his reign, he starts thinking that maybe being under Nebuchadnezzar is not that great. So he decides he's going to rebel against Babylon. And he decides even to possibly reach back to Egypt for help in the midst of this. However, this all goes very unsuccessfully. Nebuchadnezzar sends his forces to Jerusalem in around 589, maybe 588. The dates always get hairy in this sort of thing. But he sends his forces there to Jerusalem. And essentially what happens is, if you could imagine, you're there in Jerusalem. It's a city on a hill. It's kind of got some natural fortifications there, but it also has some really brilliantly made walls there to help fortify the city. But essentially what happens is Nebuchadnezzar sends his forces and they set up a siege system around the city of Jerusalem. Now, what is important to understand about a siege is this is an act of attrition. So basically what happens is that when a surrounding nation is surrounding a city, the people that live inside there, they're cut off from the world. They don't have ability to really gather many resources, and your food supply is limited to what you can produce within the city walls. And this siege happens, and again it begins 589 to 88 roughly, but it lasts a year and a half. So there's a year and a half where not only is there a lot of death and chaos in the city, but also their resources are depleting, and there's a lot of very sorrowful tales and songs and things relating to this time. But it's a very unfortunate thing. It's a very miserable place to be. As we can look back to things like World War II and World War I, we hear stories of people eating belts and shoes to survive when they're cut off from food. This is the reality of what Jerusalem is under. It's a very, very tragic thing. It's very horrifying to understand life at this time. Meanwhile, as the city is losing its resources, the army around them, they start to tear down the walls. Nebuchadnezzar eventually even has the walls of Jerusalem raised, ensuring that the city could never be fortified again. After they seize the city, they tear down the walls again. You can hear all this loud stuff. If you could just imagine living there when the forces of Babylon finally come, they destroy basically everything. They come in, they destroy the temple, the very symbol of God's holiness here on earth. They destroy the palace and the homes of the elite in Jerusalem. Basically, they just lay fire to the whole city and destroy just about everything. It is worth noting that while Jerusalem is a very significant city historically, it really only has 2 times of being totally destroyed in this manner. And of course, we have the time here with the Babylonians here in the 580s, and then again in about 70 AD when the Romans, they deal with the Jewish revolt. But that's another matter for another day. But during this siege, they kill a lot of people, but those who survive are taken off to be captives in Babylon. Interestingly, we hear stories of how they carried their musical instruments with them, and even the Babylonian soldiers making them sing songs of the city of Jerusalem, which adds an extra layer of horror to the situation. It's just one thing to be saying you're a soldier, you're told to go get this unruly nation under control that's a subordinate nation. But it's a whole other thing to add this element of, well, we destroyed your city, and now we're going to make you sing songs of how wonderful your destroyed city is. That adds a whole nother level of evil to this situation. So why do we talk about this? The book of Haggai takes place in the year 520, which is about 70 years after all this happens. Again, the city is successfully destroyed in around 587, 586-ish, and the people are hauled off in captivity. So there's about 70 years or so between the book of Haggai and the destruction of Jerusalem. And the reason why this is so important is because people were old enough to remember this. They were old enough to remember being not just taken away to another land, but everything they held holy, their entire world being destroyed, and knowing that there was really not much for them to go back to. Now, when Cyrus the Great comes and liberates the captive Jews, they go back to Jerusalem, they have cedar homes, they have a moment of semi-prosperity. And the question for them is, what did they do next? The temple is gone, which means the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant are gone. The Ark of the Covenant was lost when Babylon comes and sieges Jerusalem. And the question for the people is, what do we do next? Can we build a temple? Can we have faith in God if we don't have the symbol of God's holiness? What do we do? So let's talk about this a little bit, and then we'll wrap up our program. Because the question I want us to ask, and me and Anthony will both discuss this and then we'll wrap things up, is what would people today do in that situation? Now that you have liberty, what will you do with it? Anthony, what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think based on, what people today with liberty do with it, I don't think that they would do very much. I think that honestly they would try to make an appeal for some sort of beyond manageable reparations, and they wouldn't do it in a way that was very becoming either, in a very graceful way. And, I think that, if the people of today suffered in the same way, yeah, I mean, maybe they might have learned from that experience. But, if you just transported the same attitude that's held today concerning liberty, especially, and put it in those people,
Yeah.
it wouldn't go very well.
Yeah, people today don't really appreciate liberty as we should. And on top of that is a lot of times people we have this weird thing in our society where we elevate victimhood and we attribute that as some sort of virtue, as it makes you an expert in anything if you become a victim of something, as opposed to your virtue coming from how you overcome the victimizing situation. It's a very interesting thing of turning events on their head and saying we're going to remove effects from causes. There's no connection between causes and effects. It's a really damaging thing. But basically, what would people do in this situation? And when I say situation, I mean, do you rebuild the temple? Do you rebuild Jerusalem? Do you rebuild your faith in God? Do you rebuild the holiness of God? So many times in history we find that people don't. One of the things that's so fascinating about the book of Haggai is we actually see in a time and place where people, when given the opportunity, when given the freedom, they weren't doing it themselves, but when called by God, called by the prophet Haggai to rebuild God's holiness, they actually did. Which what we can take away from that is there are bad things that can be in our past, personally, and by some other external factor, whether it be by lineage or circumstances which happened before our birth. But that doesn't have to dictate who we are. Our free will still plays a pretty big role in it. And that's an important lesson we can take from the siege of Jerusalem, and as that's contrasted by the people living in the book of Haggai. If you haven't read the book of Haggai, you can read it in just a few moments, very quick. But it all ties back to the siege of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. Well, I hope you really enjoyed our program today. If you liked our content, please share it. If you want to help us out, the best thing you can do for us now is to just simply share our content. And if you'd like to leave us a comment, we'll do our best to respond to you in a very quick and timely manner. Again, if you want to find our podcast, you can find it on iTunes, SoundCloud, and CastBox. You can download it for free. We're on YouTube and Facebook. You can find us at Kingdom of the Logos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a blessed day.